The high desert of New Mexico territory stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, its silence broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the crackling of a small campfire. Texas Ranger Samuel "Sam" Bradley sat hunched over his meager flames, nursing a cup of bitter coffee and contemplating the emptiness that had become his life. At 38, Sam had spent the better part of 2 decades wearing the silver star of the Texas Rangers, tracking outlaws and keeping the peace along the turbulent frontier. His weathered face told the story of countless days under the merciless sun, and his gray-streaked beard bore witness to nights spent alone under the vast western sky. The death of his wife Martha 3 years prior had left him a hollow man, going through the motions of duty while his heart remained buried in a small cemetery outside Austin. The wind picked up, sending sparks dancing into the darkness and causing Sam to pull his coat tighter around his shoulders. October in the high country could be unforgiving, with temperatures dropping rapidly once the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks. He was 3 days out from Santa Fe, tracking a gang of cattle rustlers who had been plaguing the ranchers in the area. It was then that he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind, but his trained ear caught the pattern, the soft shuffle of moccasined feet moving carefully through the brush. Sam's hand moved instinctively to his Colt .45, his body tensing as he scanned the darkness beyond his fire's reach. "I know you're out there," he called softly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Come into the light where I can see you." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows, small, slight, moving with the careful grace of someone who had learned that sudden movements could mean death. As the firelight illuminated the newcomer, Sam felt his breath catch in his throat. She was Apache, probably no more than 16 or 17 years old, with the high cheekbones and dark eyes characteristic of her people. Her traditional dress was torn and dirty, and she clutched a thin blanket around her shoulders, with hands that shook from more than just the cold. Most striking of all were her eyes, large, dark, and filled with a combination of fear and desperate hope that cut straight through Sam's battle-hardened defenses. "Easy there," Sam said, slowly removing his hand from his weapon and holding both palms out in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl remained frozen at the edge of the firelight, her dark eyes darting between Sam's face and the rifle propped against his saddle. She was clearly debating whether to run or stay, and Sam could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. Whatever had brought her to his campfire, she was at the end of her rope. "You look cold," Sam continued, his voice gentle, "and hungry. Why don't you come closer to the fire?" The girl spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. The words were in Apache, a language Sam didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably one of someone asking for help. Her voice cracked with emotion, and Sam could see tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm sorry, miss," Sam said, shaking his head regretfully. "I don't speak your language, but you don't need words to understand cold and hunger." Moving slowly to avoid startling her, Sam reached into his saddlebags and retrieved a spare blanket, one that had belonged to Martha, kept close out of sentiment rather than necessity. He held it out toward the girl, maintaining eye contact to convey his peaceful intentions. "Here," he said simply. "This will help with the cold." The girl stared at the offered blanket for what seemed like an eternity, her internal struggle playing out across her expressive features. Finally, desperation won over caution. She stepped forward and accepted the blanket with trembling hands, immediately wrapping it around herself on top of the thin covering she already had. The relief on her face was immediate and profound. She sank down onto a flat rock near the fire, close enough to feel its warmth, but still positioned to flee if necessary. For several minutes, they sat in silence, two unlikely companions, sharing the meager comfort of flames and warmth in the vast wilderness. Sam studied the girl carefully, his ranger's training automatically cataloging details. Her moccasins were worn thin, suggesting she had traveled far on foot. Her dress, while torn and dirty, was well made and decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of care and skill in its creation. Most telling of all were the bruises on her wrists and ankles, dark marks that suggested she had been bound recently. "You're running from something," Sam said, more to himself than to her. Or someone. The girl's head snapped up at his words, and though she clearly didn't understand English, something in his tone must have conveyed meaning. She spoke again in Apache, more urgently this time, her hands gesturing toward the darkness behind her. Even without understanding the words, Sam could read the fear in her voice. Sam reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of hardtack and some jerky, offering them to the girl. She accepted the food gratefully, eating with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. As she ate, Sam found himself wondering about her story. What had brought a young Apache woman to wander alone in the desert? Where was her family, her tribe? The fire popped and crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on their faces. Sam poured himself another cup of coffee and gestured to the pot, raising his eyebrows in question. The girl nodded, and he poured a second cup, handing it to her carefully. The hot liquid brought color back to her cheeks, and for the first time since her arrival, she seemed to relax slightly. She spoke again, this time more slowly, as if trying to make herself understood through tone and gesture rather than words. "I wish I could understand you," Sam said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'd like to help, but I don't know what kind of trouble you're in." As if in response to his words, the girl reached beneath her blanket and pulled out something that made Sam's blood run cold. It was a cavalry button brass, with the distinctive eagle and shield design of the U.S. Army. But this button was different. It was covered in dried blood. The girl held it out to Sam, her eyes wide with terror as she spoke rapidly in Apache. She pointed to herself, then to the button, then out into the darkness, her meaning becoming increasingly clear despite the language barrier. "Soldiers," Sam said grimly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're running from soldiers." The girl nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face as she continued to speak. Her hands moved expressively, painting a picture of violence and loss that transcended language. Sam's jaw tightened as he began to piece together what might have happened. The Apache Wars had been raging intermittently for decades, with atrocities committed by both sides. But in recent months, there had been disturbing reports of rogue army units operating beyond their orders, attacking peaceful Apache settlements and taking captives. If this girl had escaped from such a situation, "How long have you been running?" Sam asked gently, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would comfort her. The girl held up fingers, first one hand, then the other, then part of another. 7 or 8 days, if he was reading her correctly. 7 or 8 days of running through the desert, surviving on whatever she could find, staying ahead of whatever pursuit might be following her. Sam made a decision that would change both their lives. Standing slowly, he moved to his horse and retrieved his spare bedroll, spreading it out on the opposite side of the fire from where he had planned to sleep. "You can stay here tonight," he said, gesturing to the makeshift bed. "You're safe with me." The girl looked at him with such profound gratitude that Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him like that, like he was someone who could make a difference, someone worth trusting. As the night deepened and the temperature continued to drop, Sam added more wood to the fire and settled into his own bedroll. Across the flames, the Apache girl curled up in the blankets he had given her, but her eyes remained open, watching him with a mixture of wariness and hope. "What's your name?" Sam asked softly, pointing to himself. "Sam. I'm Sam." The girl understood the gesture, if not the words. She pointed to herself and spoke a single word. "Ayana." "Ayana," Sam repeated, trying to pronounce it correctly. The girl smiled for the first time since her arrival, an expression that transformed her entire face and reminded Sam of how young she really was. As the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, Sam found himself keeping watch not just for the rustlers he had been tracking, but for any sign of pursuit. Something told him that Ayana's story was far from over, and that by offering her sanctuary, he had stepped into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple act of kindness. But as he watched the girl finally drift off to sleep, her face peaceful for the first time since her arrival, Sam realized that he didn't care about the potential consequences. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond his badge and his duty. He had someone to protect, someone who needed him, The lonely ranger had found something worth fighting for in the most unexpected place, around a campfire in the middle of nowhere, with a shivering Apache girl who had trusted him with her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. But tonight, under the vast New Mexico sky, two lost souls had found a moment of peace in each other's company. And for Sam Bradley, that was more than he had dared to hope for in a very long time. Dawn came slowly to the high desert, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that gradually gave way to the harsh blue of another cloudless day. Sam Bradley woke to find Ayanna already stirring, her dark eyes alert and watchful as she scanned their surroundings. The wariness that had briefly disappeared during sleep had returned with the light, and Sam could see the tension in every line of her body. "Morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Ayanna turned toward him, and Sam was struck again by how young she looked in the morning light. 17 at most, he decided, probably closer to 16. Whatever she had endured, it had aged her beyond her years. Sam built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, then offered Ayanna more of his meager supplies, hardtack, jerky, and some dried fruit he had been saving for emergencies. She accepted the food gratefully but ate sparingly, her eyes constantly moving to scan the horizon. As the coffee heated, Sam studied the girl more carefully in the full light of day. The bruises on her wrists were darker than he had initially thought, and there were other marks, scratches on her arms, a healing cut on her cheek, and something else that made his blood boil, rope burns around her neck. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath, his hands clenching into fists. Whatever had happened to her had been bad, worse than he had initially imagined. Ayanna noticed his reaction and followed his gaze to her neck. Her hand moved instinctively to cover the marks, shame flooding her features. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice filled with what sounded like apologies. "No," Sam said firmly, catching her attention. He shook his head and pointed to himself, then to her, his expression serious. "Not your fault. Whatever happened to you, it wasn't your fault." Though she couldn't understand his words, something in his tone seemed to reach her. The shame in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Hope, perhaps, or simply the recognition that this strange white man with the kind eyes was different from the others she had encountered. They were finishing their meager breakfast when the sound of approaching horses reached them across the desert. Sam was on his feet instantly, his hand on his gun as he counted the hoofbeats. At least 4 riders, maybe 5, approaching from the south at a steady pace. Ayanna heard them too, and the reaction was immediate and terrifying. She went white as a sheet, her entire body beginning to shake as she scrambled to her feet. She spoke urgently in Apache, tugging at Sam's sleeve and pointing toward a cluster of rocks that might provide concealment. "Easy," Sam said, trying to calm her even as his own instincts screamed danger. "Let me see who it is first." But Ayanna was beyond listening. The sound of horses had triggered something primal in her, a terror so deep and complete that rational thought had abandoned her entirely. She grabbed the blankets Sam had given her and started toward the rocks, moving with the desperate urgency of a hunted animal. The riders crested a small rise about a quarter-mile away, and Sam felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the distinctive blue uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry. 5 men, riding in loose formation, their brass buttons and equipment gleaming in the morning sun. At their head rode an officer, a lieutenant, judging by his insignia, with the kind of pale, thin face that spoke of too much time spent in saloons and too little spent in honest work. Sam's hand moved to his badge, the silver star that had opened doors and commanded respect throughout the territory. But as he watched the soldiers approach, he found himself thinking of the bloody cavalry button Ayanna had shown him the night before. "U.S. Rangers," the lieutenant called out as they drew near. "Identify yourself." "Texas Ranger Sam Bradley," Sam replied, his voice steady despite the tension he felt. "What brings the cavalry out here, Lieutenant?" "Morrison," the officer replied, dismounting along with his men. "Lieutenant James Morrison, Fort Stanton. We're tracking escaped prisoners, Apache hostiles who attacked a settlement near the fort." Sam felt his blood chill, but kept his expression neutral. "What kind of attack?" Morrison's smile was cold and predatory, the worst kind. murdered a family of settlers, burned their homestead. We managed to capture several of the savages, but one escaped during transport. Young squaw, probably 16 or 17 years old. The lie was so blatant, so casually delivered, that Sam had to fight to keep his expression from betraying his thoughts. Everything about Morrison's story rang false, from the too convenient details to the way the man's eyes constantly scanned their campsite. "Haven't seen any Apache," Sam said carefully. "Just been tracking some cattle rustlers through this area." "Is that so?" Morrison's gaze had settled on something near the fire, and Sam's heart sank as he realized what the lieutenant was looking at. Ayana's moccasin prints were clearly visible in the soft earth around their campsite, too small and distinctively shaped to belong to anyone but a young Apache woman. "Interesting tracks you've got here, Ranger," Morrison said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Look fresh, too." Sam's mind raced, calculating odds and options. 5 armed soldiers against 1 ranger, with an innocent girl caught in the middle. The odds weren't good, but Sam had faced worse. What worried him more was what would happen to Ayana if these men got their hands on her. "Cattle rustlers sometimes use Apache trackers," Sam said, his voice casual despite the tension in his chest. "Could be you're following the same gang I am." Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Could be. Or could be you're harboring a fugitive, Ranger. That would be a serious crime, even for someone with your authority." The threat was clear, but Sam had spent too many years dealing with bullies and corrupt officials to be intimidated by a jumped-up lieutenant with delusions of authority. He straightened to his full height, his hand resting casually on his gun. "But are you questioning the integrity of a Texas Ranger, Lieutenant?" Sam's voice carried the quiet menace of a man who had killed when necessary and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. "Because if you are, I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next words." For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the dying campfire, the weight of unspoken threats hanging heavy in the desert air. Morrison's men shifted nervously, their hands moving toward their weapons as the tension ratcheted higher. It was then that one of the soldiers, a grizzled sergeant with 3 stripes on his sleeve, spoke up. "Lieutenant, maybe we should move on. If the ranger says he hasn't seen anything." "Shut up, Sergeant," Morrison snapped, his eyes never leaving Sam's face. "I'll decide when we move on." But the moment of confrontation had broken something in the lieutenant's confidence. He was a bully and a coward, Sam realized, the kind of officer who commanded through fear rather than respect. And bullies, in Sam's experience, usually backed down when faced with someone who wouldn't be intimidated. "We'll be moving on then," Morrison said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But Ranger, if I find out you've been lying to me—" "You won't," Sam replied simply. "Because I'm not." Morrison mounted his horse with unnecessary force, causing the animal to skitter sideways. "Spread out," he ordered his men. "Search the area. Look for signs of recent Apache presence." As the soldiers began to scatter, Sam felt panic rise in his throat. They would find Ayana's hiding place within minutes. The rocks she had fled to provided concealment from a distance, but wouldn't withstand a thorough search. It was then that Sam made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Moving with the casual confidence of a man completely at ease, he walked to his saddlebags and retrieved a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for cold nights on the trail. "Lieutenant," he called out, holding up the bottle. "It's been a long morning, and the sun's getting hot. What say we share a drink before you head out?" Morrison's eyes lit up at the sight of the whiskey. Clearly, the man had a weakness for alcohol that overrode his better judgment. "Well, that's neighborly of you, Ranger. Don't mind if I do." As Sam poured drinks for Morrison and his men, he kept up a steady stream of conversation about cattle rustlers, weather patterns, and the challenges of law enforcement in the territory. It was meaningless chatter, designed to keep the soldiers' attention focused on him rather than their search. But even as he talked and joked with the men who were hunting Ayana, Sam's mind was working furiously. Morrison and his soldiers weren't just looking for an escaped prisoner. They were covering up something bad enough that they were willing to lie to a federal lawman to keep it hidden. The bloody cavalry button flashed in Sam's memory, along with the rope burns around Ayana's neck and the terror in her eyes when she heard the approaching horses. Whatever had happened at that alleged settlement attack, Sam was willing to bet his badge that the Apache had been the victims, not the perpetrators. "Good whiskey," Morrison said, downing his drink in one gulp. "We don't get quality like this at the fort." "Made in Kentucky," Sam replied, refilling the lieutenant's glass. "Friend of mine ships it out from Austin." As the alcohol flowed and the morning heat intensified, the soldiers' search became increasingly half-hearted. Morrison was clearly more interested in drinking than in capturing fugitives, and his men took their cue from their commanding officer. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Morrison called off the search. "Mount up," he ordered, his voice slightly slurred from the whiskey. "We're wasting time here." "Good luck with your rustlers, Ranger," Morrison said as he swung into his saddle. "And remember, if you see any Apache, your duty is to report them to the nearest military authority." "I'll keep that in mind, Lieutenant," Sam replied, his voice neutral. As the soldiers rode away, Sam watched them until they disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he dare to breathe properly, the tension leaving his body in a rush that left him feeling weak and shaky. "Ayanna," he called softly. "They're gone. You can come out now." She emerged from the rocks like a ghost, her face streaked with tears and her entire body trembling with suppressed terror. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to communicate something important. "I know," Sam said gently, though he didn't understand her words. "I know they were bad men. I know you were right to be afraid." Ayanna approached him slowly, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand why he had protected her. When she reached him, she did something that caught Sam completely off guard. She took his hands in hers and brought them to her forehead, speaking words that sounded like prayers or blessings. Sam felt tears prick his eyes at the simple gesture of gratitude. In that moment, he realized that his life had fundamentally changed. He could no longer simply pursue cattle rustlers and return to his solitary existence. Ayanna needed protection, and the very people who should have been providing it were the ones she was running from. "We need to find someone who speaks Apache," Sam said, more to himself than to her. "Someone who can tell me what really happened to you." As they broke camp and prepared to move on, Sam found himself facing a decision that would define the rest of his career as a Texas Ranger. He could turn Ayanna over to the authorities, following the letter of the law and washing his hands of whatever complexities her case involved. Or he could trust his instincts and protect her, even if it meant going against his own government. Looking at the young woman who had trusted him with her life, Sam realized there was really no choice at all. Some things were more important than following orders, and protecting the innocent was the most sacred duty of any lawman worth his badge. The lonely ranger had found his purpose, and he would see it through to the end, whatever the cost. 3 days after the encounter with Lieutenant Morrison and his men, Sam, Bradley, and Ayanna arrived at the small trading post of Mesilla, a sun-baked adobe settlement that straddled the border between New Mexico Territory and Mexico proper. The post served as a neutral ground where Apache, Mexican, and Anglo traders could conduct business without the usual tensions that plagued the frontier. Sam had hoped to find someone here who could speak both English and Apache, someone who could help him understand Ayanna's story. What he found instead was Father Miguel Herrera, an elderly Franciscan priest who had spent 30 years ministering to the Apache people and bore the deep lines of compassion and wisdom that came from a lifetime of service to others. "Ranger Bradley," the priest said in accented but clear English, rising from the bench outside his small chapel as they approached. "I heard you were asking about someone who speaks the Apache tongue." "Father," Sam replied, removing his hat respectfully, "this young woman needs help, and I need to understand what happened to her." Father Miguel's weathered face grew grave as his eyes took in Ayanna's appearance. The healing injuries, the haunted expression, the way she stayed close to Sam as if he were her only anchor in a hostile world. The priest spoke to her in fluent Apache, his voice gentle and reassuring. Ayanna's response was immediate and overwhelming. She burst into tears and began speaking rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of grief and terror that made the priest's face grow darker with each passing moment. "Dear God," Father Miguel whispered in Spanish, crossing himself as Ayanna continued her story. "Dear merciful God." "What is she saying?" Sam asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Father Miguel held up a hand, continuing to listen as Ayanna spoke. Occasionally he would ask a question in Apache, and she would respond with even greater emotion. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the girl's words trailed off into quiet sobbing. "Ranger Bradley," the priest said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "I think you should sit down." Sam remained standing, his jaw set in the stubborn line that had gotten him through countless difficult situations. "Just tell me what she said, Father." Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, as if searching for words adequate to the horror he had just heard. "Her name is Ayanna, which means eternal blossom in her language. She is 16 years old, the daughter of a peaceful Apache chief who had been trying to negotiate a treaty with the territorial government." "Go on," Sam said grimly. 2 weeks ago, a patrol from Fort Stanton arrived at her village under the pretext of conducting treaty negotiations. The patrol was led by Lieutenant Morrison, the same man you encountered." Sam felt his blood turn to ice. What happened? Morrison claimed to be carrying new treaty terms from the territorial governor, but instead of negotiations, he and his men attacked the village at dawn while most of the warriors were away hunting. They killed the women and children first, then waited for the men to return. Father Miguel's voice broke slightly as he continued. "Ayanna's father tried to surrender, to save what was left of his people. Morrison shot him down in cold blood, then ordered his men to take prisoners for questioning." Sam's hands clenched into fists. Prisoners. Young women mostly. Ayanna was among them. They were not treated as prisoners of war, Ranger. They were treated as spoils of conquest. The rope burns around Ayanna's neck suddenly made terrible sense, as did the terror in her eyes when she heard approaching horses. Sam felt a rage building in his chest unlike anything he had experienced since Martha's death. "How did she escape?" he asked through gritted teeth. Father Miguel spoke to Ayanna again, his voice infinitely gentle. Her response was shorter this time, but no less painful to hear. "On the third night of captivity, one of Morrison's men, a sergeant she thinks, had too much to drink and became careless with the ropes. Ayanna managed to free herself and 2 other girls. They ran into the desert, but the soldiers pursued them on horseback." "The other girls?" Father Miguel's silence was answer enough. After a moment, he continued. "Ayanna hid in a canyon for 2 days, while the soldiers searched for her. When she finally emerged, she had only one goal, to reach the Mexican border, where she might find sanctuary." Sam turned to look at Ayanna, who was watching him with those large, dark eyes that seemed to hold far too much pain for someone so young. The full magnitude of what she had endured, and what she had lost, hit him like a physical blow. "Father," Sam said slowly, "I need you to ask her something for me." "Of course. Ask her if she trusts me enough to help her get justice for what happened to her people." Father Miguel translated the question, and Ayanna's response was immediate and fervent. She stepped forward and took Sam's hands in hers, speaking directly to him in Apache even though she knew he couldn't understand the words. "She says," Father Miguel translated, "that you are the first white man who has shown her kindness without asking for anything in return. She says her father told her that not all white men were evil, and that she believes you are proof of his words." Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Tell her that I'm going to make sure Morrison and his men pay for what they did, but I need her help to do it." As Father Miguel translated, Sam began to formulate a plan. Morrison and his patrol had committed what amounted to war crimes, but proving it would be nearly impossible without evidence. It would be the word of an Apache girl against that of a U.S. Army officer, and Sam knew how such cases typically ended in territorial courts. But Sam had advantages that Morrison didn't know about. As a Texas Ranger, he had authority that crossed territorial boundaries, and he had contacts throughout the Southwest who owed him favors. More importantly, he had witnessed Morrison's behavior firsthand and could testify to the man's character. "Father, I need you to do something for me," Sam said. "I need you to write down everything Ayanna has told you, in both English and Spanish. Make it as detailed as possible, and sign it as a sworn statement." "Of course, but Ranger, you must understand, this kind of testimony will not be well received by the territorial authorities. There are those who believe the only good Apache is a dead Apache." "Maybe," Sam said grimly, "but there are also good men in positions of authority, men who believe in justice regardless of race or politics. I know a few of them, and they'll listen to me." As Father Miguel prepared to take Ayanna's formal statement, Sam found himself thinking about his next moves. Morrison and his men were probably back at Fort Stanton by now, confident that they had covered their tracks and eliminated any witnesses to their crimes. They had no idea that one witness had survived, or that she had found a protector willing to risk everything to see justice done. But Sam also knew that going up against an army officer would require more than just testimony from an Apache girl and a frontier priest. He would need evidence, corroboration, and allies who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. "Ayanna," Sam said, getting the girl's attention. "Father, ask her if she can lead me back to her village. I need to see what Morrison left behind." Father Miguel translated, and Ayanna's response was immediate and frightened. She spoke rapidly, gesturing toward the north with obvious distress. "She says the village is cursed now." Father Miguel translated. "The dead have not been properly buried, and their spirits cry out for vengeance. She is afraid to return." "Tell her I understand her fear," Sam said gently. "But if we're going to get justice for her people, I need to see the evidence of what Morrison did. I need to document everything, so that when I present this case to the authorities, they can't dismiss it or cover it up." Ayanna listened to the translation, her face grave with concentration. Finally, she nodded slowly and spoke a few words in Apache. "She will take you there," Father Miguel said, "but she asks that you help her perform the proper burial rites for her people first. She says their spirits will not rest until this is done." "Of course," Sam said without hesitation. "It's the least I can do." As the sun began to set over the small trading post, the three of them, the Texas Ranger, the Apache girl, and the Franciscan priest, began planning what would essentially be a mission into hell. They would return to the site of Morrison's massacre, document the evidence of his crimes, and ensure that the victims received the dignified burial they deserved. But Sam knew that even if they succeeded in gathering evidence, the real battle would be fought in courtrooms and government offices, where prejudice and politics often mattered more than truth and justice. Still, he had to try. Ayanna had trusted him with her story, and he would not let her down. That night, as they prepared for the journey ahead, Father Miguel pulled Sam aside for a private conversation. "Ranger," the priest said quietly, "you must understand what you are undertaking. Even if you succeed in bringing Morrison to justice, there will be consequences. The army does not like to admit that its officers are capable of such atrocities." "I know," Sam replied, "but I can't let this go, Father. I won't let Morrison and his men get away with murder." "And the girl? What will happen to her when this is over?" Sam was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had been troubling him since he first decided to help Ayanna. "I don't know," he admitted. "Her tribe is gone. Her family is dead. She's alone in a world that sees her as an enemy just because of the color of her skin." "She could stay here," Father Miguel suggested. "I have worked with Apache refugees before. There are communities in Mexico that would accept her." "Maybe," Sam said, "but that decision is hers to make. Right now, the most important thing is making sure Morrison pays for what he did." As they settled down for the night, Sam found himself thinking about the road ahead. He had spent most of his adult life enforcing the law, but he had never faced a case quite like this one. The law was supposed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But what happened when the guilty wore the uniform of the United States Army? Sam knew that pursuing Morrison would likely end his career as a Texas Ranger. The political pressure to drop the case would be enormous, and even if he succeeded in bringing charges, he would have made powerful enemies who wouldn't forget or forgive. But as he watched Ayanna sleeping peacefully for the first time since he had found her, Sam realized that some things were more important than career advancement or political considerations. Justice was one of those things, and if it cost him his badge to see it done, then so be it. The lonely ranger had found his cause, and he would see it through to the bitter end. The journey back to Ayanna's village took 2 days of hard riding through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the New Mexico territory. Sam, Ayanna, and Father Miguel traveled in heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might find at their destination. The Apache girl grew more withdrawn with each mile, the familiar landmarks triggering memories that were almost too painful to bear. On the morning of the 3rd day, they crested a small ridge and saw it, the remains of what had once been a thriving Apache settlement. Even from a distance, Sam could see the blackened ruins of wickiups and the scattered bones that spoke of Morrison's thorough brutality. Ayanna stopped her horse at the ridge, her face pale and her hands trembling on the reins. She spoke softly in Apache, her words carried away by the desert wind. "She says the spirits of her people are calling to her," Father Miguel translated, his own voice heavy with emotion. "She says she can hear her mother's voice among them." Sam felt his jaw clench as they descended into the valley. Nothing could have prepared him for the full scope of Morrison's atrocity. Bodies lay scattered throughout the settlement, left unburied for the carrion birds. The lieutenant had made no attempt to hide his crimes, apparently. He had been confident that there would be no survivors to tell the tale. "Dear God," Father Miguel whispered, crossing himself as they rode through the carnage. This was not a battle. This was butchery. Sam dismounted and began methodically documenting the scene, his ranger training helping him maintain professional detachment despite the horror surrounding them. He counted bodies, noted the positions where they had fallen, and carefully examined evidence that would support Ayana's testimony. What he found made his blood boil. The victims had clearly been shot at close range, many while trying to flee. There were no weapons among the dead Apache, no rifles, no arrows, nothing to suggest they had offered any resistance. This had been a massacre of innocence, plain and simple. Ayana moved through the ruins like a ghost, stopping at each body to speak softly in Apache. Father Miguel followed, administering last rites and helping her identify the remains of her family and friends. The priest's weathered face was streaked with tears as he witnessed the young woman's grief. "This one," Ayana said suddenly, speaking in broken English for the first time since Sam had known her. She knelt beside the body of an elderly man whose gray hair was matted with dried blood. "My father, Chief Nailnish." Sam approached respectfully, removing his hat as he looked down at the man who had tried to make peace with the white world, only to be murdered for his efforts. Chief Nailnish had been shot 3 times, once in the back as he tried to run, then twice more in the chest at close range. "I'm sorry," Sam said quietly, the inadequacy of words never more apparent. "I'm so very sorry." Ayana looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. He trust white man's word. He think treaty bring peace. The broken English, learned from traders and missionaries, somehow made her words even more heartbreaking. Sam knelt beside her, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm his professional composure. "Your father was a good man," Sam said gently. "What happened here wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's fault except Morrison's." They spent the rest of the day preparing the dead for burial according to Apache custom, with Father Miguel performing additional Christian rites for those who had been baptized. It was grim, heartbreaking work, but Sam knew it was necessary both for Ayana's healing and for his case against Morrison. As they worked, Sam continued gathering evidence. He found cavalry buttons scattered around the camp, along with Army-issue brass cartridge cases, and even a dropped cavalry glove with Morrison's initials sewn inside. The lieutenant had been arrogant in his assumption that there would be no investigation. That evening, as they sat around a small fire some distance from the burial site, Father Miguel spoke quietly with Ayana in Apache. The conversation went on for some time, with the girl occasionally gesturing towards Sam. "She wants to know what will happen now," the priest finally translated. "She asks if the white man's justice will punish those who killed her people."